Hello, welcome to Lawrence County History Corner. Today we're talking about floods. Now, we are so familiar with flooding in this area. Of course, most of us have all heard of the 1937 flood, which was one of the worst to hit our area and resulted in the flood walls that surround Ironton. There was others before, but this flood in particular occurred in June of 1906, and it actually struck the little village of Scottown, located about 22 miles from Ironton. It is near the branches of the Indian-Gandat Creek, and it is known for its valleys above the village of being long and narrow. The storm, which would rage began around 11 o'clock on a Monday evening and did not end until 4 o'clock Tuesday morning. The rain poured for hours with no let up. And what made the storm worse was the fact that it wasn't just a storm. It was actually 3 storms. According to the local newspaper, the first storm came from the west. The second came directly across from the river, and the third came from the south. It was described as a black, threatening clouds of each disturbance were charged with their own electricity, and the heavens were one continual glow of dazzling brilliancy. The thunder was incessant, and there seemed no cessation. The storm from the west and the southwest seemed to pass over the village of Scottown with little rain. However, the one from the south, when it hit, brought far worse conditions. And according to the author of the local article, the electrical display was awful in its grandeur. The heavens seemed to crack and split as the forked tongues of lightning shot from a central point in every direction. The heavy downpour, of course, of rain immediately caused all the creeks and waters to overflow into the valley, causing homes and buildings of every description, including fences, bridges, trees, were swept away in the raging water. The worst part, of course, this is happening in the middle of the night, so many of the people were sleeping at first. And it was actually alarm that had to be raised before many of the people who realized that they were in danger. There was, of course, being woke up in the middle of the night, a lot of confusion, followed by excitement, not in a good way. And, of course, then the people began to realize just how bad the flooding was. And, of course, then the terror and the fear set in. Many people fled until the hills, the nearby hills, still in their night clothes, not waiting to take a chance to put on their clothes. Some were forced to stay in their homes and take their chances later on their house escaping the flooding waters. Not one house in Scottown was missed by the flood, and the property loss could hardly be estimated. The general store owned by McCaffrey and Thomas Lewis was reportedly washed away, and the loss to them will be, it tells you the totals, but it doesn't tell you the amount. There were houses that did remain, but even if they did remain, they were washed over, twisted away from their foundations and badly damaged. Mrs. Sayer and her daughter, Mrs. Mannon, occupied a cottage in the center of town, and the Mrs. Sayer was actually drowned before she could be rescued. Mrs. Mannon barely escaped, although almost meeting the same fate as her mother. She did survive, but she suffered severe injuries that may still, at the time this article was written, may not survive. Other women and children had very narrow escapes from drowning. Exposure of the people who did escape was pretty severe, and many people suffered injuries or medical problems because of the exposure to the poor weather. And at first they expected a lot of fatalities adding on, not from the actual flood, but from the terror, the accidents, and other things related to the flooding. An entire family named Dylan had not been heard from. They were all missing. The crops the farmers looked upon that they had worked so hard to take care of and plant were ruined. The barns, their fences, the outbuildings were washed away. Many of the livestock was drowned. Bridges were washed out, and in some places the county roads were completely obliterated by the downpour. It was a terrifying experience for those who were living it. The storm that spawned the flooding in Scottown also struck other areas. And in the semi-weekly Irontonian on the 8th of June, 1906, there is a description by the Wilgus, according to the newspaper correspondent. He talks about at 2 o'clock in the morning when the most severe storm hits the county. One of the most severe storms that ever hit Lawrence County, that section of Lawrence County, passed over Wilgus. But just after the storm passed over the Trace Creek Hill, Valley Hill, it met the one with the south. And of course, that was the one that they said caused the most damage. The damage done in Long Creek Valley was slight compared to what happened to Scottown. Long Creek was at the highest was at its highest as it is ever known, according to the oldest residents in the area. But aside from the damage to crops and some stock, people living on Long Creek was uninjured. At Scottown, however, that was not true. There was at least one fatality, and there were many others suspected. E. Schaefer's house near Trace Creek was moved off its foundation. Wall's store was washed away entirely, as was Jesse Burcham's store. And 1 mile above Scottown, the Jesse Burcham store was taken 1 mile above Scottown, down a creek. The post office in the village also was taken down the creek and ripped off its foundation. Water was up to the top of the counter in the platform store owned by and then John Dobbs, the veteran harness maker, and his wife had to be rescued. 2 feet of water was found in James Joseph's house, and the iron bridge over Trace Creek, just as the entrance to the village, remained anchored and intact. Mr. and Mrs. Perry Mannon, who was mentioned earlier, Mrs. Perry Mannon was actually the daughter of Mrs. Sayer, had gone to Scottown to visit her mother, and Mrs. Sayer's home was in the center of town, just west of the pike, and the water came rushing down the valley. They saw that the flood was imminent. Mr. Mannon went for a horse to rescue them, and while he was absent, the house itself was washed off its foundation and carried down to the bottom. Mrs. Mannon kept her mother's head above water as long as possible, but ended up to save herself, was compelled to let her mother loose, and Mrs. Sayer died. Mrs. Mannon stood in water up to her chin for 2 hours before she was rescued. She was either standing on a bed or on the windowsill with her head as far up as she could get towards the ceiling. It was reported later that Mrs. Mannon died 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, but the time that the article was written, no one knew if that was true. It was also purported that Dr. E.N. Miller lost all of his medication, or drugs, it says, and his library. But obviously, the Mannon and Sayre family suffered one of the greatest loss. And that is just part one, and there is more to come about the Scottown Flood.